Hey everyone, so over the last couple of days we've talked about the causes and then the fighting of World War I. Today we're going to start talking about the end of World War I and its long-term effects, including what would happen to the United States, what would happen to Germany, what would happen to the other allied countries as a result of World War I, as well as what was happening in Russia that would have long-term consequences for all of us. So one thing that we did not talk about the other day was the huge momentum swing that would end up occurring as the U.S. entered the war. As we talked about the other day, the war had become a stalemate where people are fighting in trenches and not much movement is taking place. And for much of World War One, roughly 3 out of the 4 years of the war, the United States wanted to remain out of the war, remain neutral. Many citizens in America felt that World War I was Europe's fight. They did not want to be pulled into the sort of destruction and the loss of life that fighting in that war would bring. Um, and at this point, we're about 60 years removed from the Civil War. So people, are still living that, grew up with those images of the sort of destruction that war would bring. And so even though we tried to remain neutral, as soon as the war began in 1914, we really weren't so neutral. We began supplying the Allied powers, especially Great Britain, with food, with supplies, with weapons. And this really angered Germany. And so even though we were able to stay out of the war for 3 years, it was probably inevitable at some point that we may end up joining the war because we were aiding Germany's enemy. And so Germany became angered by this, and they attempted to intercept the aid of the Americans. So as these things were being shipped over to Britain, they would attempt to shoot down boats, either with a submarine or some other vessel, and just attempting to really hurt the aid that the United States was trying to give to the Allied powers. And they also wanted America distracted from actually entering the war more fully as well. And so both of these things could be true at the same time. They're angered at America. They're starting to attack us in certain ways or attack our supply ships, but also they want to keep us out of the war. But over time, Germans began to anger the United States in certain ways. So for one, they started to patrol the North Atlantic and the U.S. coastlines using submarines, especially. And the Germans ended up sinking a ship called the Lusitania as well. And aboard the Lusitania, which the Germans claimed had supplies that was going to the British, there were a lot of civilians on board, including about 150 Americans, and that immediately angered a lot of people within the United States. And then one of the final major things was something called the Zimmermann letter. And the Zimmermann letter was a German message that was sent to Mexico, which told Mexico to attack the U.S. to sort of keep us from attacking Germany, right? Keep us distracted with certain things. And in return, Germany would help get territories that Mexico had lost back to the Mexicans. And so territories like California and Texas, places that used to be part of Mexico and were now a part of the United States, Germany would help them get back. Luckily, the message was intercepted by the Americans. This was published, and this angered a lot more Americans as well. And so in 1917, after these sorts of incidents and several others that I have not mentioned, the U.S. ended up declaring war on Germany. And so the U.S. entered the war, and this would end up breaking a almost 3-year stalemate that had existed in these trenches and in the fighting itself. And so this brought momentum to the side of the Allied powers, and now the end of the war was in sight. But the most important thing to come out of the U.S. entering the war was that it showed that we were a true world power. We are a relatively young nation, and this was our, sort of coming out party. We are showing that we are a very strong and powerful nation. And so, what you end up getting is that within a year of the United States joining, on November 11th, 1918, at 11:11 a.m., almost $200 billion into the fighting of the war ends up ending. The Central Powers are defeated. The Allied powers that include France, Great Britain, US, and Italy have won the war. And so plans for peace begin to be formulated. But it's also important to sort of think about why Germany actually ended up surrendering, aside from the US joining the war. So for one, Germany decided to surrender, and that's what really ended the war for a couple reasons. For one, there were dwindling resources. They were running out of money, food, equipment, able men to be able to fight the war. You can recycle old uniforms and stuff like that, but you cannot recycle men who may have died during the fighting. And so that became something that, not only was a problem in the war effort, but also caused discontent at home. Citizens in Germany began to become angry at the length and the destruction of the war. They began to protest more. They wanted to fight back against what was happening and the ways in which the military was sort of controlling the country at that time. And then also, like I said, the U.S. had swung the balance of the war. And so after beginning to fight in early 1918, the U.S. really helped to swing that momentum from what was a bloody stalemate towards the side of the Allied powers, and really started to put a hamper on Germany. And finally, the last major reason that they ended up surrendering was that their allies had also already surrendered. So in the weeks before Germany decided to surrender, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, which were their only two major allies in the war, they'd already surrendered. And so they had no other major help coming. The writing was on the wall. They were going to lose the war, and so they finally decided to surrender. And so out of that comes the Paris Peace Conference. And this was a meeting of the members of the Allied powers. And, out of a time of war, you must have talks on how to move forward with peace. And so, what are the terms that they're going to agree to in order to allow Germany to surrender and not to continue attacking Germany? And so these talks are going to occur mostly between France, Great Britain, the US, and Italy. And this is one of the most momentous events in the history of the modern world because of a lot of the effects that come out of how these central powers were treated, including how allies of the Allied powers, like Italy, were treated as well. And so Germany and other countries, they have no voice in these talks, and the resentment that would form from various countries, both on the losing side and on the winning side, would last for decades. Now, out of the Paris Peace Conference, you have several different plans that end up sort of being formulated. And one of them was the 14 points. And this was a plan that came from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time. And he sort of formulated a plan that you can see on the left there of what the post-war world would look like, and had 14 points for it. And he desired to treat Germany more leniently and less harshly than the other European countries, a lot of whom, especially France, were very angry with Germany over the course of the war. But out of the 14 points, the one that was the most important was his desire to have what was called a League of Nations. And this would be an international organization where countries could work out their problems, that, we'd all be in sort of the same organization, talk about world issues, talk about how we can move forward without, resorting to having war. And the League of Nations was extremely important, not only as trying to formulate a new way of dealing with diplomacy, but also because its failure over the course of time was going to be one of the reasons that it led to World War II. And so out of this Paris Peace Conference, you get the Treaty of Versailles, and this is the actual document that is going to end World War I. So the treaty was created by these four allied powers, France, Britain, United States, and Italy. And like I said, there's sort of a difference in how each one wants to treat Germany and how harsh they wanted to treat Germany in this process. So France wanted to treat Germany incredibly harshly due to all of the destruction they saw and all the destruction they felt by this enemy of theirs. And they had the most hand-to-hand combat, other than like maybe the Italians and British in the war, especially on the Western Front. But like I said, United States President Woodrow Wilson, this was much more lenient on Germany, sort of saying, let bygones be bygones. And, you know, in terms of the treaty itself, France was listened to a little bit more. Wilson ended up having most of his points ignored, except for the creation of the League of Nations. However, with this League of Nations, the U.S. Congress refused to allow the United States to join this. And so you have this major power player who is not in it, and it ends up weakening the organization. So like I said just a minute ago, France ends up winning out on a lot of these issues, and they end up treating Germany incredibly harshly. For one, Germany was forced to sign a war guilt clause, accepting total blame for the entire war, right? They were also forced to pay reparations, so all damages for the entire war. And the amount of money that this was completely crushed the German economy. And even up until a few years ago, Germany had not fully paid it off. And so this was like 100 years that it took them to pay off the entire debt from World War I. Then the German military was also forced to reduce to basically be non-existent. As we said before the war, German militarization, German building up of the Navy and the Army caused other countries to build up. And so Germany was forced to completely almost eliminate their military. They were able to have a couple soldiers and, you know, not much else that would be trained to fight. And then on top of that, territories that were controlled by Germany, these were given to Britain and France. So any of their territories in Africa or any in Asia were given over to the British and the French. So the Italians get nothing out of this in terms of territorial gain, and then also the United States does not get territorial gain, even though they show that they are a major player on the world stage. Now, another major thing to come out of World War I was what would happen to Russia. We talked about at the beginning of the war how they were a part of the Allied powers. And, you know, over the course of the war, things happening within Russia would cause them to sort of drop out of the war. And, you know, this became known as the Russian Revolution. Now, just a little bit of background. Russia had been an absolutist monarchy where the monarch, again, controls everything within the country. And this figure, what we would call a king, was known as the Tsar. And this had been in place since the mid-1500s. And Russia, just given its size and its difference in terms of ethnicity across the country, it's both a European and an Asian nation. This was, you know, a country that was very difficult to manage, and you know, for many different reasons. On top of that, they had an economy that had never sort of evolved past like the feudal system. And so you have a lot of poor farmers who are, you know, running things for very rich nobles, and the peasants in the country and the poor farmers far outrank in terms of the numbers of people, the number of nobles. And so, very, very, very slowly in the early 1900s, the country is starting to industrialize. And so some people are starting to move into the middle class and starting to move off of the farms. However, the country's leadership, like Tsar Nicholas II, refused to see these changes and refused to compromise in a way to allow people more freedoms. And so this is going to lead to rebellion over time, and at a time in which, for the Tsar, can least afford it. So during the war, like I said, Russia became part of the Allied powers. And the unfortunate part for this was that as a country, they weren't fully prepared to actually fight this. They did not have the amount of money, the amount of food, the amount of manpower that it would take to fully take on Austria-Hungary and Germany to fight and win the war. They were poorly equipped. They were poorly led. Tsar Nicholas, who was not a great military leader, took on control of the military, and this led to millions of people dead. 1.7 million Russians died during the war. 4.9 million Russians were wounded during World War I. And this was something that was quite costly to morale at home, especially at a time in which people are angry over food shortages that are taking place in order to fund this war, along with it being a very poor country. Now, while Tsar Nicholas went off to control the army, he left his wife Alexandra in control of the government. And she became blamed as well for the hardships that were being felt at home, especially people starving, people not having enough money to live on. And this was especially true when she put in control a mystic or a basically like a psychic or a supernatural sort of person named Rasputin in charge of the country. And Rasputin would just sort of go based on premonitions that he had, and he's quite a classic figure throughout the history of the world. If you want to know more about Rasputin, there's documentaries made about him. Certainly his life and his death are very, very infamous. And so she becomes, blamed for all of these things that are happening. And in March 1917, you start to have people getting more and more angry and going more and more over the top in terms of their outpouring of anger over what was going on in the country. And so because Tsar Nicholas was not able to compromise, because he was not able to get people what they needed, he ended up losing control of the Russian army first, and then the Russian parliament, what is called the Duma, what we would call our Congress, they call it the Duma, asked Tsar Nicholas II to step down. And so the Duma in this time then formed a temporary government. Now, World War I, like I said, had destroyed Russia's economy. And given the fact that their traditional leadership, sign of power, the Tsar, was now gone, and a temporary government was put in its place, which did not necessarily have the total loyalty of the power of the parliament, there was now sort of a power vacuum that was going to be filled by something or someone if nobody took control of the country. And so using this turmoil, a revolutionary by the name of Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled years before by the Tsar to Germany, he ends up coming back to back to Russia. And he comes in 1917 when the Tsar steps down, and this parliament is running the government. The Germans, sensing weakness and wanting to sort of stick it to the Russians, actually sent Vladimir Lenin on a train during the night back into the country as if he were a missile coming into to Russia's system. And he started to begin to try to convince workers to take over the government under a communist system. And communism, for those who don't know, is a type of government in which all classes are equal and all share equally in wealth and power. And usually a communist government has a socialist style of government in which the government controls all major industries and lands. And so what resulted was a civil war, and this became known as the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks were Lenin's group, and that's why it becomes known as this. And so this would run from 1918 to 1920, and on top of World War I, this civil war ends up leading to the deaths of 14 million Russians. And this includes Tsar Nicholas II and his family, who were killed by the revolutionaries. If you've ever seen the movie Anastasia, it sort of goes into the deaths and the possible escape by his daughter Anastasia, who may or may not have been killed, and that's been the subject of a lot of controversy and debate. They may have proof at this point that she definitely died during this unfortunate murder. So going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin and his followers would end up winning, and what they established in its place was the Soviet Union, and this became known as the world's first communist government. This is going to become incredibly important to us when we talk about the Cold War and the resulting things that happened as a result of the Soviet Union being established. So just to go over the overall outcomes of this war, because we've talked about so many. For one, like we just talked about, the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union comes out of World War I and the anger that people were feeling over Russia's involvement in the war within Russia. And then U.S. becomes a world power as a result of sort of swinging World War I towards the Allied side. You also have Austria-Hungary, which I did not talk about. They are split up and they become two separate countries, Austria and Hungary. They lose a lot of their territories, a lot of the former territories like Serbia, like Czechoslovakia. They become their own countries. That rise of nationalism ends up, leading to them getting their own countries. Germany becomes blamed for the war, and out of that humiliation, out of the anger, out of the poverty that ends up hitting Germany, would rise, people who would begin to scapegoat the rest of the world, and this would lead to the rise of the Nazis overall. And then finally, you have a winner of the war who is angry about not getting enough in the Treaty of Versailles. And so Italy becomes angry at not receiving, more for being on the winning side and helping out the Allied powers and coming to their aid during the war. And they end up feeling ignored. And this is also going to lead to a rise in a fascist government under Mussolini that would impact us in World War II. All right, with all of that being said, the World War I, incredibly important, not only for obviously the lives lost and the fighting that was done, but also because of what the end of this war means to the rest of the 20th century in and around the world. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know. And other than that, have a great day.